Hi everyone, I'm Manny, and you're listening to BayonBayou with Manny. This 7-episode podcast on anti-Asian hate, being Cambodian, and COVID-19 gives voice to Khmer 1.5 and second generations who are championing change in a time of racial divide in America. These stories showcase their unique journey of struggles and successes to make a difference in a country in which they call home. Today, I'm talking to Randy Kim. Randy is a founder of the Banh Mi Chronicles podcast, a second-generation Khmer-Vietnamese American, self-identified queer, a board member of the National Cambodian Heritage Museum in Chicago, and a storyteller of Asian American immigration experiences. He is determined to bring visibility to the Asian American Pacific Islander communities. Hi, Randy. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for bringing me on here. It's an honor, and thank you for a wonderful introduction.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. Let's start with your own story, Randy. You were born in Chicago to Khmer and Vietnamese refugee parents. And in 1976, your father escaped Cambodia's Khmer Rouge genocide on foot to a refugee camp in Thailand. And your mother left southern Vietnam by boat in 1981. They each experienced their country's civil wars. What was it like growing up in your household?
I think growing up, there was a lot of uncertainty and confusion. What I remember most about my childhood, and the early parts of it, was the languages that was around me. What I didn't share with you prior in our previous conversation was uh, when my parents were working full time. I was also raised by a babysitter from Peru, and that babysitter was an old 70-year-old woman who was not working, and I was also learning Spanish. So I had Spanish, English, Vietnamese, and Khmer all at
Wow.
once. And the problem was that I never knew how to deal with the languages before I was 5 years old. So it was also part of the reason why I was very mute for
Mm.
a good part of my early childhood years. So yes, I would say confusion of language, uh, confusion of what was going on with my parents because they were always working, and when they would be home, they were always in distress.
Hmm. What kind of distress did you notice in your parents?
With the distress, I think my parents were always fighting. Um, my parents were always um, trying to figure out what to do, or they were always worried about my brothers and I, of how we were going to navigate into this uncertainty. I mean, there was no blueprint of what being American is and how to fit in, but also how to be successful in a country that is not your land. I mean, my parents were only in America for a few years at
Mm.
that time, and they were just trying to figure out how to survive. So when you're in survival mode, there's chaos, there's stress, and that also feeds into the children, including myself. And yeah, I must say it was such a difficult a way of figuring out why was I raised this way compared to my classmates who felt more at ease.
Mm.
At ease with parents who were always accompanying them and going to their games,
Mm.
being able to understand how their community works. For my parents, they had no connection to that community. They were just out working and trying to survive.
Right. So they weren't as involved in your hobbies or in your life as much as you would like them to be.
Well, for that, yes, but they were very involved in how academically successful I should be.
Yeah, it's all about the education, isn't it, with Asian families?
Right, absolutely.
Hmm. I wanted to touch on the interracial dynamics within your own family. As you know, there is racial tension between Cambodia and Vietnam, dating back to the Khmer Empire, so from the 9th century. And even now, in the 21st century, there is still discord due to ongoing geopolitical issues. Have you experienced your own anti Vietnamese sentiment from the Khmer community or vice versa growing up?
Oh, absolutely. I definitely felt that from my dad's side of the family, even though I am particularly close with them for many years. And my dad's side of the family was born in the Khmer Krom, which is part of now Vietnam. And there's many ethnic Khmer folks that lived in that particular region below the Mekong Delta or the Mekong River. And I will say that a lot of the Khmer folks are oppressed as we speak. They can't speak their language. They can't openly have Khmer signs. I visited that part of the area back in 2009, and it was very eye-opening to see the erasure that was taking place.
Mm.
With that said, it made me understand why my family side feels very frustrated with the Vietnamese and why they have such anger. However, they really love my mom. They
Mm.
really, in some ways, probably like my mom way more than my dad sometimes. But but I also knew that I could never be fully Khmer to them. I could never be fully Vietnamese to them. And on the Vietnamese side, I don't hear much about it, but I knew that there was a distrust. I knew that my mom's side of the family did not have many Cambodian people that they were even close to or that they could call friends. So it was very separate. Both sides of my family never disowned us, but I knew that there was always tension. I knew that there was this lingering anti-Vietnamese, anti-Khmer side when I would go to family parties. You can kind of feel the vibe.
Yeah, that's interesting. What about you? Where did you fit in all of this?
Yeah, I'd say that the whole experience of being Viet Khmer always led me to be very guarded about my closeness with the community, knowing full well that whatever I do would always come under a level of suspicion, right?
Mm.
If I was speaking out on issues that they may not agree with, or which both communities may not agree with, there's a part of me that feels that my identities would be weaponized against me because of the fact that I'm mixed and also because I'm American born too. So there's different layers that they would feel would be a threat um, or a person that to not be taken seriously.
Coming up, Randy talks about navigating his own Khmer and Vietnamese identities.
Shared that same sentiment that their parents
Mhm.
also told them that they were never enough, and we bonded over these traumas. We bonded over this sense of collective loss.
Yeah. And how did it make you feel? I mean, you were limited to embracing all these dimensions that makes you you. What would you have liked to change if you had a choice in the matter?
Hmm. You know, it prevented me from being close with both communities for a good part of childhood through a good part of my adulthood up until maybe the last few years. Not being able to speak both of my parents' languages was also particularly very difficult for me. So there was this shame, there was this frustration that I can't be a part of these communities because I did not fit the criteria. I couldn't do the language. I couldn't um, fit the mode. I wasn't close with either communities, so I couldn't claim where I needed to be. So I felt like the best response for me was to westernize myself as much as possible. Uh, and by doing that, I became an English major. I was into writing. I was hanging out with more white friends. I was hanging out with other um, uh, BIPOC, which is like other Black, Latinx, and other Asian folks down the road, but not so much in my own community. I felt like I had to overcompensate what I did not have. But by doing so, I also realized that I still fell short. I
Mm.
was not seen as fully accepted by white peers because I still deal with the micro level of racism and biases. So it made me realize like how important it was for me to figure out where my community is. And the community that I first came across was Asian expats, and that led me to being around folks of the diaspora. And as I got closer to folks of the diaspora, I started meeting with other Viet Khmer diaspora folks. And that made me realize that I was not alone in this, that I was not the only bastard child. I was not this really special, unique um, person with this story. There was more of people who were mixed, who struggled with assimilation trauma, uh, that struggled with being accepted by their own communities, right? So it had to take these experiences to get me to that place, right? But
Mhm.
to get to that journey means having to confront these very difficult experiences of being told that you are not one of them many different
Right.
times, not just by one aspect of it, but different communities telling you that.
Yeah, I could see that being tough. You have a lot of identities and I'm sure that was a challenge for you in finding a community where you can relate to and where you feel like you belong. Speaking of being mixed, you are a second generation Khmer Vietnamese American. Which one of these cultures resonates most with you?
Hmm. It took me a really long time to figure out that answer. But I think the last couple of years, when I came back to Chicago, I met up with a good friend. Her name is Lek Yun, who is a Khmer American, and she was the first one to really understand me. And I was really taken by her spirit and by her willingness to just go with the flow and not care what other people of her community think. And I think that
Yeah.
gave me permission to really step into the community a bit more. Um, and so, yeah, I became more involved with the Cambodian community in Chicago and more particularly with my peers, my like-minded second generation peers, right? And so it was such an eye-opening experience because it was terrifying at first because I knew that I was going to have to relive part of that pain of
Yeah.
not being enough, not being this shame and stigma of not being able to understand family's culture and bringing that shame of not being able to do that. So it it was difficult at first, but there were other folks shared that same sentiment that their parents
Mhm.
also told them that they were never enough, and we bonded over these traumas. We bonded over this sense of collective loss. I guess in to answer this question, I was more closer with the Khmer community, and was because of that that led me to become a board member for the Cambodian museum up in Chicago, and it would not have happened had the community or my friends really trusted me to be a part of that community. I think the past few years into my 30s, I'm more self assured and proud of these identities and these struggles that I have with me, and that they are a part of how I deepen my compassion for other community members, how I find ways to understand these layers and what they mean to me, that they are not a burden, that they are an asset. So that's probably the best way of navigating through all these struggles and where I belong.
Yeah, that was a journey for you. And thank you for sharing that. And I'm glad you finally found your community and your identity.
As I evolve, the people around me tend to evolve too. So it's an ever changing landscape.
And it's nice to be with people who are constantly growing and bettering themselves. Let us touch on race and racism for a little bit. What's your earliest memory of becoming aware that there is more to you than just being an American?
I think just being in my school from K through 12, I
Yeah.
think that was an everyday experience of being reminded what race is and what was then and what is now. And, dealing with the fact that I was told how different I was through jokes, through the way that they taught history. When they were teaching Asians in history, it was either seen as the villains and sometimes the victims.
Mm.
Villains like the Japanese American internment or the Japanese American imprisonment during World War II, Pearl Harbor, uh, the atomic bomb, the Chinese American railroad workers. Uh, we were seen as the villains in many of these stories. With the Vietnam War, it was both the villain but also the victims too, because there were always these images of Vietnamese women and children being terrorized. And so it did not paint the full humanities of all of us. And in fact, I think when we are taught these parts of our history, but nothing about the accomplishments, the contributions that Asian Americans and Asian diaspora folks or Asian folks from the continent have contributed to our society as a whole, and not seeing yourself in the history books was telling us that we are not loved. It was telling us that we do not matter. And it informs our parents that this is what we need to be in order to be successful and to survive. But there was nothing that shows us how do we thrive. And erasing our history is simply a violent act. I had this is something that a lot of my friends who have been in social justice work talk about. This erasure of our history is simply a form of white supremacy. It's basically making sure that we are not given the tools to thrive as part of the society that's growing and that needs our voices. Going around with question marks is not a fun experience, I must say.
Yeah. Earlier, we talked about racial discrimination within your own family, which is a blend of the Khmer and Vietnamese cultures. Let's touch on race in the mainstream society. Did you experience racism? And if you did, what racist experience had the most impact on you?
I must say that remembering in, I believe it was in eighth grade, where some white kid basically came to the bus and looked me dead in the eye and said "Jap" to me, even though I wasn't Japanese, but it was clearly with ill intent, and it was done in such a malicious way. It was rather jolting because I could never understand what it was that made him harbor such ill will towards me. And I wondered if it had something to do with our own education system, was learning about Japanese folks as the villains contributing to that. I wonder about some of my own classmates who grew up not realizing that they were racist.
Mm.
Um, and I think as I got older, found myself being distant from some of them. And I don't think many people understood why. But because those things do not leave you, and also because I felt at this point in my life that I deserve better. I deserve respect. I'm not some token person.
Yeah, I get that. Coming up, Randy says sharing his own experiences of being a queer Asian American helped him to be less guarded.
they resonate with my stories of being mixed or being queer or being all of the above, and it made me realize how much power that my story has.
Is it okay if we talk about your sexual identity for a little bit?
Sure.
Okay.
So, to me, you are a unicorn and an oxymoron. In addition to having a Khmer-Vietnamese background, you have self-identified yourself as a queer Asian American. I want us to unpack this for a little bit. Earlier in our conversation, when I asked if you were openly gay, you had said that you are queer. I have always thought that the word queer was used as a derogatory term, but in your case, it's not. So, what's the difference between being queer and being gay?
Well, I will say that I'm probably not the best person to give the fullest definition, but I'll give you my own. Well, queer is also a political identity in some ways too, because queer was a derogatory term, as you pointed out, for a long time, but it was just recently reclaimed by many queer identifying folks because it is about a sense of reclaiming what really should be ours, what how we define ourselves. And queer is actually a very broader term. It can also accompany being gay, but also that you may particularly be deciding or realizing that there might be other people you might be attracted to, whether they are trans, whether they are non-binary, or maybe um, even a person of the opposite gender. So I think that queerness to me is more broader for a person like myself who does not like to be defined by one aspect. I want to have a better sense where there's flexibility, where there is a sense of fluidity in my own being, because I'm always constantly evolving as a person. I wanted to define myself and not being specifically tied to one set group of people, because I could also be in love with other community members that I can also open myself to. So I think that's the best way of defining that. And I think that yes, if someone called me gay, I wouldn't be bothered by it because because most of the time I am attracted to men, but I also know that I'm not completely tied down to that either.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing you say is that it's very open and very fluid, right?
Correct.
Okay. When did you know you were queer? And how did you come out to your family and friends?
Puberty. I mean, don't we all know? I think we all do know when we have feelings,
Yeah.
when we have feelings that we can't seem to control, right? And family and friends, well, this could be a really this is very complicated. Um, my parents had a very hard time with the idea of queerness early on, and I think my mom in particular started noticing that I was different, that I was not necessarily the masculine type. I was more um, considered femme acting or feminine acting. My mom would always give me ominous warnings about being gay, and she was pretty troubled by that. And so that led me to become very guarded with my parents. I actually had a very distant relationship with my own parents for a really long time. Like sometimes even if my mom was nice to me asking me how I was doing, I wouldn't answer her that question. I wouldn't answer the simplest questions, even if it meant no ill will, because I was so guarded. Because I knew that the possible rejection was going to hurt a lot more. So, how do I combat that? I combat that by being very guarded. So, yes, I felt a sense of protection of myself, and that protection was verging on paranoia, constantly worrying about what other people were thinking, trying to control my narrative as best as I can. Um, and growing up right after the AIDS HIV crisis, it certainly made me realize how the environment that I grew up in was not safe for LGBTQ folks. It wasn't until I came back to Chicago right after Korea back in 2012, and I was about to turn 30. And by that point, I mean, there are people that did know that I was um, a queer man, but I just didn't feel comfortable necessarily being public about it. And it wasn't until I met this wonderful group of API queer trans folks through a group called I2I, which means invisible to invincible, uh, Asian Pacific Islander Americans. It's an LGBTQIA group. It's rooted in social justice work, and I was quite attracted to that. And it helped to inform my own views. It helped to unlearn many of the cisgender hetero white narrative that we were fed for so long. And dismantling that was my own way of liberating myself, but it was also my way of learning to love myself even more. Sorry about the long about.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm just glad that you were comfortable enough to process this out loud with me. So thank you. And this leads me to my next question. What are some challenges you experience in living your life and being true to who you are?
All these lived experiences were times that I was afraid to confront that for so long, not knowing who was there for me, not knowing who I could turn to.
And trust, yeah.
Yes, and as I started to document my own stories, whether it's on Facebook or through a blog or through social media, I realized how much power that carries with me, but also how much it can also give others the permission to start telling their own stories. I've had people come up to me and told me personally that they resonate with my stories of, being mixed or being queer or being all of the above. And it made me realize how much power that my story has. It made me realize how important my story actually matters to people. And as I've learned to hear other people's stories, I also realize how much they matter, how much they influence the work that I want to do, how much they influence my own mindset and challenge my own prejudices that I have. I remember going to other community members, especially in the Cambodian community, and ask them about maybe finding ways to tell their stories. The first thing that they will always say, a lot of community members in Asian communities will always say, "Oh, I don't have a story. I don't think it matters." Well, no, actually, there is stories there that do matter, that do need shine. You don't have to be a celebrity. You don't have to be a prolific person or have a level of status to tell a story.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Stories and storytelling, because you are also a storyteller for the Asian American communities. In October of 2019, you launched your first podcast, the Bun Me Chronicles. Essentially, it is to uplift the AAPI community. What prompted you to start a podcast?
Well, about 2+ years ago, I was in the car dropping my mentor, Dr. Ada Cheng, home, and we had just finished one of our storytelling events, and her and I co-produced a show together called Talk Stories, an Asian American Asian diaspora storytelling show. So I was helping her to facilitate that show, and I loved how, doing that show, I loved how much excitement there was in bringing different Asian American storytellers, particularly ones who had never told their stories for the first time. I think there was such an excitement to that. And Ada told me once, and she said, "Well, Randy, I also want to challenge you to find your own independent project. You're capable of it." And I told her that I did not know what I really wanted to do, that I did not know what I would commit to. I think the commitment was something that scared me because I don't want to go into a project and say 1 to 3 months later, I abort it. And that was my own past experiences. I felt some of it can be too overwhelming, that I maybe went in over my head with this. So I needed to figure out what was it that I could really commit to, that I could see myself being passionate about. And it was around that time that I was invited to be a guest on a few podcast shows. Well, two of them in particular was the Queer Asian Social Club and the Vietnamese Boat People podcast. And I really enjoyed my experiences with Tracy of the Vietnamese boat people, and Maya of Queer Asian Social Club, we had this amazing conversation. I love the way that they were facilitating these stories and the conversation that we were having. And I thought to myself, well, maybe I should consider a podcast. I do miss interviewing people because I was going into journalism back in my undergrad days. I really wanted to bring in other people that should be sharing their stories, but also I want to hear the work that they are doing for their community and their families. I felt, looking back as a kid, I never had the proper education about our history, and I never got it in college. I only learned about Asian American leaders through I2I. It was through social justice folks. They were the ones that taught me who Grace Lee Boggs was. They were the ones that taught me who Yuri Kochiyama was or Fred Korematsu. And I felt, well, we need to change that because we shouldn't have to wait this long. I shouldn't have to wait till I was almost 30 to learn who these figures are. So I wanted to do a podcast that was in a way a love letter to my past young versions of myself from 7 to 12 to 15 to 20, 25. I wanted to have a show that I could listen, that my younger self needed to listen to. So the Banh Mi Chronicles podcast was created out of that need to bring the history of our stories, but also to be the blueprint for our own future, for the generations that are not born yet or not ready to hear them right now, but will be down the road. So I wanted a podcast that can really touch on these issues of diaspora, of assimilation trauma, of community empowerment work.
Your mentor gave you a challenge and you rose to the occasion. So that's really cool. I really like what you said about informing the younger version of yourself, because wouldn't it be great if we have roadmaps and resources and mentors on how to navigate life? Coming up, Rani explains why sharing our Asian American stories will assert our place in the American narrative.
I know there are people that celebrate Angelina Jolie and her accomplishments in Cambodia. What about our own people who are actually doing the real work?
What kind of issues or topics do you dive into on your podcast?
As I mentioned, I go into issues of intergenerational trauma, assimilation trauma. I bring up stories that I also personally relate to, dealing what the effect of assimilation does to our own selves, navigating in America where white narratives are very dominant and that they are the preferred choice in what we learn, and how that affects people like us when we don't have that history together. And when we don't have that history, how we collectively struggle as people in finding our voices. So for me, it's digging through that journey, but also digging through the conflicts of our own community, our own Asian communities, our own parents, and what they have gone through, and how this informs our own beliefs, our own thinking. So it was important for me to go through this kind of excavation of their stories, but I didn't want to just focus on the trauma aspect
Right.
of it. I also wanted to focus on the the process, the joy, the the resiliency in us, and also what led us to, or what led them to, the work that they are doing for their communities. I I will say that when I think of guests that I would like to have, I don't just think of having the highest profile guest. I think of people who have really important stories that must be shared, that people can really see themselves in these stories.
You have interviewed a spectrum of Asian Americans, including Korean, Thai, Laotian, Vietnamese, Chinese, and Cambodian Americans. Who are your guests and what's the overall connecting themes shared by their stories?
When I think about my own guests, I don't know if there is a particular secret, but I think about what people need to hear about them. Why are they important to this? Why do I want to put them out to the universe? What is it about their stories that speaks to them? I don't look for success stories. I look for the humanity. I look for the complications. I look for the process in their journeys. And when I have had on my guests, what really ties them all together is having a sense of humility and vulnerability in their journeys, and knowing that there are no hero that they don't need to be heroes in their stories. And so I look for guests who have a level of self-recognition, but also knowing that there's more work that needs to be done, right? And that what we believe in is not static. What I want my audience to come away with is making sure that they really see themselves in these stories, that they need to learn that history of what's going on, but they also need to know the work that our community is doing, because my brother once told me, well, I don't hear about Asian Americans doing good work. Why are we always silent? And we're trying to dismantle that as we speak. And to dismantle that is telling our stories, making sure that it is documented, making sure that it is accessible to our communities. So I wanted to make sure that my tiny, tiny part in this is to make it accessible for our community members, but also for non-Asian folks to take a chance and listen to the different stories that we have to offer, and why the Asian American experience is not a monolith. It's vast, vast, and intersectional. It's layered, and there's more to learn, and there's more to uncover, and we're just getting started. And by doing that, we become better people. We have better ways of deepening our relationships with our community by doing so.
I really admire your work. You have an incredible mission and great vision to share, grow, and amplify our roles and contributions to this country. From what I know, you are quite connected to the Khmer American diaspora. So let us talk about the National Cambodian Heritage Museum in Chicago. You are one of the board members. It was established in 2004. Is that correct?
Yes, that was in 2004 with the Cambodian Association of Illinois together, and then it became its own 501c3 back in 2015, I believe.
Okay. Tell me about this museum. Is it the first of its kind in America?
Yes, it is the first museum of its kind outside of Cambodia, actually.
Wow.
So, yes, and the genesis for that museum was needing to create a space for Khmer Rouge for Khmer Rouge genocide survivors, for refugees who had to experience what had happened during the mid to late 70s with the Pol Pot regime, and finding a place for these survivors to mourn their loved ones, because one of the saddest legacies of that part is that there was no funeral. There's no way for our survivors to honor their loved ones, and so that was a space to those who were lost, but to honor our survivors, to give them that space so that they can still mourn, but also feel a sense of community and belonging. And the Cambodian Museum was also created to educate our younger generations, because what I would find, and I think I had this conversation with you prior,
Mhm.
was that we've done tours of the museum, especially with families, and what I would notice and what other curators would notice is that their parents are actually talking about their experiences for the first time in that space.
Yeah.
I mean, to the point where the staff and volunteers, including myself, actually not lead the tour or talk about the history of the tour. They end up being the tour guides themselves, because they're telling their own history to their kids for the first time. And I got to tell you how powerful that is.
Yeah, again, I'm getting goosebumps as I'm listening to this because I have talked to a number of 1.5 and second generation Cambodians who are hungry to know about their parents or their grandparents' experiences in the Khmer Rouge genocide. However, it's not being shared because the past is too painful and traumatic for these parents or grandparents. And it's wonderful to hear that there is this venue available for them to process that and for them to feel safe and comfortable to tell their stories.
Yeah, it's an important space to create, because that past is extremely traumatic. I mean, when our refugees came into the US, there was no counseling services. There was no time for them to unpack what they had endured, not just in the labor camps, but also in the Thai or Malaysian or Filipino refugee camps. There was none of that. There was no coping. There was no healing for our community members. And when they arrived to the US, they were out having to find work within a few days of arriving. So there was never a time for them to just stop.
Yeah, and to heal and to feel all these emotions.
Absolutely. And the museum was there to serve its purpose as a way to just to have them stop and to start the healing process. I do want to say that for the museum, when we have younger generations learning about our history, it helps them to understand their parents, their relationships with them, why they struggle with us sometimes, why they struggle with, having to be the victims of assimilation when they have no idea how to navigate into this world. That is another trauma in of itself, right? So the museum is a way of bringing that compassion into this. When we start to build our own compassion, especially with our own wounds that we have from our parents or grandparents or relatives, but it also gives us the opportunity to start our own healing process, to start our own reconciliation with our family, but also with ourselves. I know we can't stop wars or genocide, what's going on in the world, but we can at least have compassion for it. We can find ways to exercise strengths to help resist that, whether it's by running for office, whether it's by writing your own books, being a teacher, being a community member.
To me, your platform is empowering and you're making impact in your own right by being the connector for the Asian American communities. As you know, we are not known to be loud. In your opinion, what are the pros and cons of not challenging the status quo?
Someone else will tell our story. Um,
Yeah.
how many times have we seen white researchers, white journalists, artists tell our stories for us? And how harmful that is when we are not allowed to tell our own narratives. I know there are people that celebrate Angelina Jolie and her accomplishments in Cambodia. What about our own people who are actually doing the real work, who are living these experiences, who are trying to challenge that? So, yeah, that's the first thing, is that we're giving other people the permission to tell our stories, and by doing so, it means that they're leaving out. And then what will our future kids will know about Cambodian Americans or Southeast Asians or Asian diaspora folks? So I would like to always challenge that with people who believe that they don't have a story because they don't have a college education. They're only working class jobs.
Right. As you mentioned before, it's not about your status in society or about being prominent, but rather it's about having that open space to share our experiences because we are all unique. Last question, and this is a personal one. There are those who are struggling with their sexuality and or self-confidence because they are not empowered to be themselves. What message do you have for them?
I would say that at the end of the day, listen to your heart because your heart is not going to lie to you. And know that there are people out there that also share similar conflicts, struggles. But know that as you get older, as you start to feel comfortable with your own being, there's power to the people that you connect with. Find the people that see you for who you are, whether it's in online spaces, whether it's in community events. I know with COVID, it makes it harder to do in-person events, but don't be afraid to seek out. Don't be afraid to reach out. I think we're all very gifted in our own ways and what we have contributions for and the possibilities that we can create. So be around people who can help open that gift, but also by doing that for yourself, you're opening up other wonderful presents.
That was wonderfully said, Randy. I also want to let you know that your message is a beautiful gift in itself. And here's my conclusion: you're curious, compassionate, and a challenger of the status quo. My takeaway from our conversation today is that we all have stories, and our stories matter. Thank you, Randy, for sharing your story with me today and for helping other people to tell their stories.
Thank you so much for your time, and And really thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing and bringing on other Cambodian folks to share their stories. I think this is the continuation of what we need to do in order for us to be not only just visible, but to be important stakeholders of our society.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoy listening to my guest journey from surviving to thriving as Khmer in America, and for the lessons they have learned and shared with us. For more stories like this, visit us at voacambodia.com. Until next time, I'm Manny, your host of BayonBayou with Manny.